Alright, this time I'd like to explain why I usually don't answer one of the most common questions that people keep asking me. Who would win, this warrior or that? And that is simply because I find the whole thing rather pointless. Understandably, it can be interesting to do such speculation, and the success of Deadliest Warrior shows that people very much like to see that. But I really hope that not many people believe that Deadliest Warrior is scientific in any way. There's just the way they do the tests is very often questionable, and the information that they give is also very often highly dubious. Not claiming to do a better job with my videos here, but there are a lot of problems with what they do, and then there's also this fake antagonism that they always play out, which is really irritating. But regardless, so probably the most common question is, who would win, a samurai or a knight? That's what people always are interested in. But it's kind of an invalid question, because knight, what kind of knight? There are so many variations to consider. For instance, it could be an 11th century Norman knight who doesn't fit the common image we have of knights. Usually when we say knight, we mean something more like this. 15th century equipment, full plate armor, and plate armor is quite a bit different depending on the time period and the region. You can go all the way up to the 16th century and you have very different types of armor and really more evolved in many ways. Also, if you compare Italian versus German, and all kinds of things to consider really. And that's just the armor. The armament is also a lot different. What type of sword? Or are they using a warhammer or a mace? Or is it a polearm? This is so much to consider. And then, of course, you have the difficulty of just comparing just hypothetical individuals. You don't know their individual fitness level, their skill level, and all of that. There's always been a lot of variation. If you take a modern soldier and compare that to another modern soldier, let's say you randomly picked an American army soldier nowadays and compared that to a Russian special forces guy, also randomly picked, and compared that to a Chinese army soldier. If you come up with any differences, like, oh, this guy clearly performed better, so that means that this nationality has better soldiers. Bullshit. Of course not. There's a lot of individual variation, and you cannot make any statements about that. Even if you say that, okay, both are equally physically fit, like in a fitness test, they would get the same score. Both are equally skilled. How do you measure skill? You could maybe say both have been professionally trained for the same period of time. But who did they learn from? What were the training methods? There is still quite a bit of difference. So you would have to have godlike powers to really establish 100% that yes, those are exactly on the same level of skill. I mean, since it's a hypothetical question, you might as well say that. But even then, it can be difficult to compare the different martial arts styles. And in many cases, we don't know enough about the martial art. Like, for example, if you take a Viking, the stereotypical image is that those were kind of dull-minded brutes who just picked up the sword and just went, just bashed everything to pieces. Mindless berserker rage, that kind of thing. But we have a pretty good idea that they had a martial art of their own and that they practiced and were reasonably proficient at it. I mean, any kind of fighter in history really would have had to train. It would have had to have some kind of system. If you just rush at the enemy and then swing like an idiot, you're gonna die like an idiot. It's just not how it works. Basically, the dull-minded brutes die off fairly quickly, you might say. But we don't know enough about that martial art to make a lot of statements. Exactly how did they fight? Well, we know they used a round shield like this, and we know what these can do. We have some basic ideas of how they might be used, but it's just not that much to go on. Of course, there are some observations we can make and some tests we can do. Like, for instance, several people, myself included, have shown that a katana is unable to cut through riveted mail. This kind of stuff here. That's what Vikings would have worn, Norman knights, later knights. It's a very common, Celts, it's a very common type of armor throughout history. And even in case of mild steel rings, again, riveted rings, very important. If they're just butted, not that effective. But mild steel rings, this thing just cannot slice through there. And later medieval mail was even made of hardened rings, so there's even less of a chance to get through there. There are just some limitations that any kind of weapon has. This here is really not suitable for use against heavy armor, or I should just say in general metal armor. And this had some pretty substantial damage from trying to cut through the mail. But depending on the type of armor, there may be fairly large unprotected areas. Like on some suits, for example, the back of the leg is relatively open, and you might be able to slice into those parts, or under the arms, for instance. So there are ways to deal with armor, of course, and that again depends on how you're trained. For example, a 15th century knight would be very well trained in how to deal with armor. You know, thrusting into the gaps, bashing the helmet with the crossguard or pommel of a longsword. If a Viking encountered a Teutonic knight in a full suit of plate, he would probably be like, oh shit, or maybe helvete. But he would have a hard time dealing with that because he simply isn't used to that much armor. Again, depending on his personal background. If it's just a random farmer who decided to go Viking, then he wouldn't have a lot of equipment. It would basically be clothing, a shield, an axe, or a spear maybe, and that's pretty much it. Whereas a huskarl would be a lot better equipped, would have a helmet, a mail hauberk, a sword and shield, maybe a Dane axe, something like this. With something like this, you may have a better chance against plate. Maybe you'll simply reverse it and strike with the other side. And whenever we discuss the differences in equipment, we of course have a personal bias. Like, for example, if you've been exposed to historical European martial arts, you may have a different view of something like this than somebody who practiced kenjutsu, say. From my personal point of view, I think that a double-edged blade is somewhat more versatile. But this is just my personal bias because these are the techniques that I know and I'm more familiar with this type of sword. So to me, it seems as if that would give you an advantage. Somebody with a different background may have a different perspective. So it's extremely difficult to compare that. And even if practitioners from two different styles, like one person from historical European martial arts, which you would have to specify further which tradition. Italian, German, Spanish, could be all kinds of things. What time period and all that. But if you had a HEMA practitioner going up against a Kenjutsu practitioner, for instance, and one of the two wins more often than the other, what conclusion can you draw from this? One of the two is simply more skilled? That doesn't tell you anything about the style whatsoever. So this is really pointless, largely. So while speculating about who might win in a hypothetical fight may be a fun thought experiment, don't expect to come up with any valid conclusions. There are just so many factors that come into it that you can hardly make any general statements that are worth anything, really. And by the way, this whole thing of my favorite warrior would totally beat your favorite warrior is really just immature sandbox behavior. So do we really need that? But, well, opinions are like ani, so feel free to battle it out in the comment section if you have nothing better to do. Other than that, thanks for watching. I guess you didn't have anything better to do than watch this video either. and I didn't have anything better to do than to make it.